Hello everyone, it's Aaron Breimer with Veritas Farm Business Management. In this video, I want to talk about how we determine at Veritas if variable rate prescriptions actually make money. This accounts for both our prescriptions as well as other prescriptions that you might write yourself or that are offered on the market. Some of you will have recognized this slide from other videos that I have done. This video it specifically focuses on the fourth pillar, the validation. So what gets measured gets managed. So a little bit of history on variable rate prescriptions as far as how Veritas has been working with them. When you're looking at variable rate prescriptions, there's a lot of different data layers that you can use. Here's a short list. There's probably a lot more. It completely depends what you want to do for your prescription. In my mind, there is one layer that is the absolute most important, and that is the data layer between your ears. It's the experience you have of that field, of that crop. You know that field, that crop better than any computer ever will. So make sure that the data layer between your ears, when you look at that prescription, you say, you know what, that makes sense. If you've got that going for you, then you've got a good prescription, at least in my opinion. Once you take all that data, you're going to create what's called a management zone map. Now, the smart kids, they call this an algorithm. So if you hear people talk about an algorithm, ultimately what they're talking about is they're talking about splitting your field into different zones, and in each zone, putting different rates. That's all an algorithm is. It's a fancy way of being able to say that. So when you hear algorithm, this is what people are talking about. So I'll give you an example of a variable rate management map. Remember, this is what a lot of people call an algorithm. This is actually one of my dad's fields. This is a corn prescription. You can see we split it up into 3 zones. The majority of these zones were created using satellite imagery as well as some aerial imagery, and of course, the most important data layer, my dad's experience on that farm. So we've got a high productivity zone, medium productivity zone, and a low productivity zone. Like I said, this is a corn example. So in corn, in those high yield zones, that's where we put the high rate. In the low yield zones, that's where the lower rates go. When we switch it up for soybeans or dry beans or lentils, legumes, and actually we're testing it on wheat this year, what we do is where the high yield zones, we actually back down the rates, and that's to reduce the chance of disease. Whereas in the low yield zones, we're pushing the yields a little bit higher. This is our formula. This is our algorithm, I guess. If you want to use something different, that's completely up to you. We'll be happy to work with you, whatever your philosophy is for your farm, for your crops. So, on the left, you can see that's that management zone map. On the right, that is the resulting yield data from my dad's combine. It's an older combine, older yield monitor, so maybe not super clean data. Hopefully you don't hold that against my dad's data. But here's what you can conclude from this, is that the highest yield came from the best soil. Yeah, not exactly earth-shattering. This does not tell you if variable rate actually made you money. This tells you that variable rate, that you got your zones right. Congratulations. Like I said, as long as you look at that data and say, this makes sense, that data layer between your ears, you're off to the races. But ultimately what you want to know, did it make you money? Now, Veritas, we've been at the variable rate prescription for a few years now, and we've always been trying to figure out, does this make money? And if it does make money, how much money is it making? So we're going to go back all the way to 2011, and this is how we started validating if variable rate was making money. So we have our prescription, and literally what we were doing was we were asking the farmer to turn the prescription on and off. This is probably how most farmers are going to test their prescriptions, because it's easy. Let's face it, this is how we've always done testing in agriculture. So there's our test strips. Now here's the problem. You might notice over on the right hand side, there's an extra wide one. Well, what happened there was the farmer turned the prescription off, and then he forgot to turn it back on. So it got it a little extra wide. Now he was willing to admit it, so we're going to call that an oopsie. He forgot to turn it back on. So it's how a lot of farmers tested. but it's not always easy to remember to turn it on and off for every field. You guys have a lot going on when you are using these variable rate prescriptions because it's the busiest time of the year. It's spring. So there is that limitation. This brings us to 2012, where we tried to make things easy. And now if you go back to this, the very first slide I shared, that's our number one pillar. How do we make it simple and easy for farmers to do it? Because if it's not, they're not going to do it. So we tried to make it a little bit easier in 2012 by pre-programming. Here's our prescription, and we asked the farmer how wide his planter was, in his case 40 feet. We asked him what side he was going to start planting. He told us it was on that upper straight angle. So what we did was we calculated it over where the planter would have a full pass. And actually, to expand it to make sure that we hit it right, we pre-programmed a strip of 120 feet in. So, and you can see we actually put 2 of them in, and farmer goes, plants it, the variable rate check strips are automatically put in there. Talk about making it easy. Here's the challenge we ran into, is if you look at those strips, on either side of those strips, there's a different amount of zone. And each one of those zones we already recognize act a little bit differently. So having those representative strips is next to impossible. In fact, what we found is if you can put that check strip in the exact right spot every time, you will win big and you'll show a huge return on investment. However, if you put it in the wrong spot, you'll lose every time and you'll lose big. So this is not really giving you the answers. Yes, you can go and digitally cut out each one of those zones and compare side by side, but that takes a lot of work. So we decided to try to make things a little bit easier, keep that easy component for the farmer, make it easier for us, and also to be able to get better data. So in 2013, we came up with this idea of Veritas. This is what we came up with, and this is what we call them. I've seen them called all kinds of different things on the market. I've heard them called learning blocks. I've heard them called learning stamps, knowledge squares. There's probably 100 different ways to call them, depending on who you're working with. This is not something specific to Veritas. What's specific to Veritas is that we put these into every one of our prescriptions. So you can see it. There's that original script for my dad, and we've put in these pre-programmed randomized blocks scattered throughout the field. These things are great. It makes it super easy for the farmer because they're pre-programmed, right? You can see lots of representation, and not only lots of representation, but a lot of replications. This is something that the statisticians really want to drive home because it is very, very important to make sure that your results are validated. The other cool thing about this is that you can include outlier rates. So in this example, those squares are 120 feet by 120 feet, so about a third of an acre. And the pink ones are 40,000 plants per acre. Now in corn, that is extremely high. Now my dad, he's got good fertility, 20-inch corn, we thought we could push it. Here's what ended up happening. Wherever those pink squares were, my dad had a perfect 120 foot by 120 foot square of flat corn. Now, if you've ever worked with a farmer and he has corn go flat, he's not going to be happy. But in this case, my dad didn't mind because he was able to see, and in this case just a few squares, that 40,000 was way too much. Imagine how upset he would have been if a third of the field, if all those green zones were in at 40,000, or a big strip right down the field, or a couple strips down the field had 40,000. Like, it would have been horrible. He would have been really grumpy. So this makes it easier to be able to include those outlier rates. It is easy to analyze the results. A pile of numbers, lots of software out there to be able to overlay different layers to be able to get results. Here's an example. You can see there's a whole bunch of numbers. I'm a big numbers guy. Lots of fun to be able to look at this. Not every farmer likes to look at numbers all day long. So in 2014, I started to work with our data scientists to come up with a better, easier way to be able to interpret those numbers. So like I said, not everyone likes numbers. Maybe you're a little bit more of a visual learner. So here we have our prescription. We've got our variablocks pre-programmed in there. And here's what we do. We create response curves. Now, if you think back to school, response curves are basically the line of best fit. So that's what the dark line is there. The shaded line is something we have called the confidence interval. I'll explain this a little bit more. So, response curves, basically the line of best fit. That's that dark line. The shaded areas, that's the confidence interval. So the more data points you have at any one point along that curve, the more confident you can be. If you think about it in terms when you're reading a newspaper article about politics and they're talking about a poll, and they'll tell you that Party A is polling at 32%, plus or minus 2.1%, 19 out of 20 times. That's confidence interval. So we actually include that. Now, the really cool thing about response curves, you can actually determine what the positive or negative return on investment. Yes, there is a negative return on investment at times. If you make a mistake, you are going to have a negative ROI. The cool thing about this is you get to learn. You get to learn what is the ideal rate. So when you hit that ideal rate, that is actually going to allow you to measure the potential return on investment. So really cool, really powerful tool here in these response curves. This is what I call the secret sauce that Veritas is working on. This allows us to be able to validate every prescription. Every prescription. Did it make money? Did it lose money? How could we make more money? These are critical. This is really, really cool stuff to be able to use on your farm, on your fields, on your prescriptions. Now, I love response curves. You may have just figured that out. However, you might want to know where on my field am I making money. So we've taken it one step further, and we take those response curves and we integrate them back into the field. So here's an example. You can see our response curves up in the right-hand corner. Hey, that's great. But now you can look on your field and say, okay, those response curves, what do they tell me on my field? Where did I make money? So you can see in this case, on this field, the actual profit. Now, when we figure out actual profit, right, we're not talking about yield, we're talking about actual profit. We take into consideration what was the difference in yield, how much was the crop worth, and how much did the seed cost. So when you put more seed down, it's going to increase the cost of the seed. So we actually take that into consideration. And then the other piece we do is we actually remove the cost of the prescription as well. So this is the net positive to the farm. And then you can see there is the potential revenue as well. You can see what the actual target rate was, and you can see what the ideal target rate was. So the actual return on investment was $13.04. The potential was another $24, all the way up to $37. And really, all we were adding was another 500 seeds per acre, and just tweaking where we were putting that 500 seeds. So huge, huge potential here. Now, I gave you a seed example. Here's an example in nitrogen. Now, interesting thing about nitrogen, when we first started working with nitrogen, I was absolutely convinced nitrogen on corn, we had to put more nitrogen in the highest yielding parts of the field. Our response curves proved to me that I was 100% wrong. And that's pretty tough for an agronomist to hear, that you were wrong. Here's why. Your highest yielding corn usually comes in from the low parts of your field. Now, the low parts of your field have a little higher organic matter. Organic matter is going to release nitrogen. So any extra nitrogen that high yielding crop needs is coming and is being supplied by the soil. So you actually need more nitrogen on your tougher spots of the field. So this was a pretty cool learning for us. Now, there's an exception to this. There's always an exception in agriculture. The exception is if you're working with cover crops or high residue situations, because those low areas, they're going to grow better cover crops, or they're going to have more residue, and that residue is going to have a high carbon content, and that high carbon content is going to need extra nitrogen to break down. This is why it takes a lot of work to be putting into a prescription, and why you have to sit there and think about if it makes sense. So algorithms are great, but does it make sense for your farm? That's what this gives you an example with nitrogen. I got one more cool example for you. I thought this one was really cool. So in Ontario, we talk about the 4Rs. I did it specifically on phosphorus. I do know that some other areas talk about nitrogen. So we talk about adaptive management. So outside of what the 4Rs tell you, or how to use the 4Rs better on your farm. Here's an example of a field that actually challenged me for a couple years. You can actually see that there's a very distinct difference in yield, and this line showed up almost every year. Now the farmer told me that there was a difference of the crops. The higher yielding areas had a history of specialty crops, vegetables, so there was going to be more fertilizer. And then on the other side, there was basically continuous corn and soybeans, and not a whole lot of extra fertilizer put down. So the yields were slowly getting worse and worse to this point. You can see where the history was vegetables, over 238 bushels for a pretty good chunk of that field, and where it wasn't, you're down to under 150, in some cases under 116. Like, wow, that's painful. So the question then became from the farmer is, what could they do about it? Fairly large farmer, you can see the size of the acres there, fairly large equipment. He wanted to know, should he invest for dry fertilizer on his corn planter? So what we did, a flat rate across the whole field with check blocks, our Vera blocks, scattered throughout of different rates of dry starter. He actually had a neighbor plant this field in order for him to be able to check. So that way he could make a better decision on his other fields, as well as if he was going to continue to farm this field, what he was going to have to do. So you can see we ranged from 0 pounds per acre all the way up to 200 pounds per acre of dry fertilizer. This is in a 2x2 beside the row. Here's the response curve. Really cool response curve. Like I said, we work off of profit. So when you look at the vertical axis, that's profit, that's not yield, that's actual profit. So what was the difference in yield, and how much did that fertilizer cost? You can see the peak of that curve before it starts to drop down again is somewhere around 135 to 150 pounds per acre. So this actually makes him money because, well, let's face it, if he was at zero, that's $700. Up at that 135, 150, he's almost at $775. Actually, he's a little over by the looks of it. So $75 an acre by making that investment. Now he can make better decisions. Now, the farmer asked an interesting question. He said, well, does that also carry over on that high yielding part of the field versus the low part of, yielding part of the field? Remember that yield map that I showed you? So we actually split the data. Now, the data here, what you're going to look at is the economics. The scale changes a little bit, so the curves look a little bit different, but the data is the same. In fact, that yellow line on the bottom one is the same curve as the one from above. That's all the data. But you can see the red curve, that is the low yielding zone. And you can see that has actually shifted from that 135-ish area to probably closer to 175 is the optimum. So in the low yielding areas, he's going to have to put a little bit more fertilizer down. Now, in the high yielding parts, it still pays, because that's what he was asking. He goes, well, this is one of my more challenging fields. Maybe I should just give this field up and focus without dry fertilizer on all my other fields. But even his high yielding parts of that field was responding. Now, not at 135. The optimum was 75. This is the power of working with response curves, data, Veriblocks. It's easy for him to execute, and it creates incredibly deep insights. So variable rate prescriptions can make you money, but if you're not measuring them, they can also cost you a pile of money. If you're interested in knowing more on how this works for your farm, give us a shout. We'd be happy to have a conversation. Thanks.